What happens when a beloved comedian sits down for what should be a simple chat about his new project, only to be met with hostility, condescension, and attacks on his character? In just 34 seconds of tense silence, a television host managed to destroy any chance of civil conversation and spark one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history. Ricky Gervais walked onto the set of Loose Women expecting a lighthearted conversation. The comedian, known for his quick wit and honest approach to comedy, had been invited to discuss his latest stand-up special. The studio audience applauded as he made his way to the panel, smiling and waving. He settled into his seat, adjusting his microphone as the cameras prepared to roll. Denise Welch sat across from him, arms already folded. Before Ricky could even finish greeting the other panelists, Denise jumped straight into questioning mode. Her tone was sharp from the very beginning. "So, Ricky," Denise began, leaning forward with a pointed stare, "your comedy has been called offensive by many people. Do you enjoy hurting people's feelings?" The audience fell silent. Ricky blinked, clearly taken aback by the aggressive opening. He let out a small laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, that's quite a way to start," Ricky said, maintaining his composure. "I think comedy is supposed to challenge people, make them think. I don't set out to hurt anyone. I set out to make people laugh, and sometimes that means touching on uncomfortable topics." Denise wasn't satisfied with this answer. She shook her head dismissively. "But you do understand that words have consequences, don't you?" she pressed, her voice rising slightly. "You can't just say whatever you want and hide behind the label of comedy." Ricky nodded slowly, still trying to keep things civil. "Of course, words have consequences," he replied. "But I think there's a difference between making a joke and actually advocating for harm. Context matters. Intent matters." One of the other panelists tried to interject, attempting to steer the conversation toward Ricky's new special, but Denise spoke over her. "Intent doesn't matter if people are offended," Denise declared. "If someone tells you they're hurt by what you said, that's the end of the discussion. You apologize and you move on." The audience remained quiet, sensing the tension building. Ricky shifted in his seat, his expression becoming more serious. "I respectfully disagree," he said carefully. "I think we can have conversations about why something might be offensive without immediately shutting down all discussion. Comedy has always pushed boundaries. That's part of its purpose." Denise let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes dramatically. "This is exactly the problem with people like you," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You think you're above criticism. You think your fame gives you the right to say whatever you want without consequences." Ricky's jaw tightened. His friendly demeanor was starting to crack under the weight of Denise's relentless attacks. "People like me?" Ricky repeated, his voice steady but firm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Denise leaned back in her chair, a smug expression crossing her face. "Privileged men who've never faced real consequences for their actions," she stated matter-of-factly. "Men who think they can joke about anything and everyone should just accept it because they're famous." The audience gasped. Another panelist tried to intervene again, but Denise wasn't finished. "You sit there in your bubble," she continued, her voice dripping with contempt, "making millions while regular people suffer the consequences of the attitudes you promote. It's disgusting, frankly." Ricky raised his eyebrows, taking a deep breath before responding. "Denise, I came here to talk about my work," he said, his tone measured but clearly frustrated. "I didn't come here to be lectured about privilege or to be called disgusting. If you wanted to have an actual conversation about comedy and its role in society, I'd be happy to do that. But this feels like an ambush." Denise scoffed loudly. "An ambush?" she repeated mockingly. "This is a conversation. If you can't handle being questioned about your choices, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye." The other panelists looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of them attempted to change the subject entirely, asking Ricky about his creative process. But Denise immediately spoke over her again. "No, I think we need to address this," Denise insisted. "The public deserves to know what kind of person they're supporting when they buy tickets to his shows." Ricky's expression hardened. He looked directly at Denise. "What kind of person am I, Denise?" he asked, his voice calm but challenging. "Since you seem to have me all figured out." Denise didn't hesitate. "Self-centered, arrogant, someone who values laughs over human decency," she listed off, counting on her fingers. "Someone who thinks being clever gives them permission to punch down at vulnerable people." The audience was completely silent now. You could hear a pin drop in the studio. Ricky sat perfectly still, processing what had just been said about him on live television. "That's quite an assessment," Ricky said quietly. "Based on what? The fact that I make jokes you don't personally enjoy?" Denise leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing. Based on your body of work, she shot back. Based on the countless complaints and articles written about your offensive material, based on the fact that you clearly don't care who you hurt as long as you get attention. Another panelist tried desperately to intervene. Perhaps we could talk about the positive response Ricky's received as well, she suggested gently. There are many people who appreciate his approach to comedy. But Denise cut her off with a sharp gesture. Those people are part of the problem, she declared. Anyone who finds this kind of humor funny needs to take a hard look at themselves. Ricky let out a short, incredulous laugh. So now you're attacking my audience too? He said, shaking his head. Everyone who enjoys my work is part of some problem? Denise crossed her arms again, her posture defensive despite being on the attack. If they're laughing at jokes that demean others? Yes, she said firmly. Absolutely, they're part of the problem. Ricky looked around at the other panelists, then at the camera, as if searching for some sign that this was all a joke. When he realized it wasn't, he turned back to Denise. Denise, I've tried to have a respectful conversation here, he began, his voice steady. But you've made it very clear that you have no interest in actually talking with me. You invited me on this show to belittle me and my work. Denise's face flushed slightly, but she maintained her aggressive stance. I invited you on this show to hold you accountable, she corrected, something that clearly doesn't happen enough in your world. Ricky nodded slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. Accountable for what exactly, he asked. Making people laugh? Creating entertainment that millions of people enjoy? Having opinions that differ from yours? Denise's voice rose sharply. Accountable for spreading harmful ideas, she practically shouted. For normalizing attitudes that hurt real people? The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Ricky took a moment, clearly trying to decide how to respond. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but filled with disappointment. I genuinely feel sorry for you, he said, looking directly at Denise. I feel sorry that you see the world through such a narrow lens that you can't distinguish between actual harm and someone simply having a different sense of humor than you. Denise's face turned red with anger. Don't you dare patronize me, she snapped. I don't need your pity. What I need is for people like you to take responsibility for the damage you cause. Ricky stood up slowly, removing his microphone. What damage? He asked, his voice filled with genuine confusion. Can you give me one specific example of damage I've caused? One person whose life has been ruined by one of my jokes? Denise sputtered, clearly not expecting this direct challenge. It's not about specific examples, she argued. It's about the overall culture you contribute to. Ricky shook his head. So you can't, he said simply. You've spent the last several minutes attacking my character, calling me disgusting, self-centered, and arrogant, but you can't actually point to any real harm I've done. One of the other panelists finally managed to get a word in. Perhaps we should take a break, she suggested nervously. But both Ricky and Denise ignored her. The harm is in the normalization, Denise insisted, her voice strained. The harm is in making people think it's okay to laugh at certain topics. Ricky placed his microphone on the chair. So thought police then, he said, his tone neutral. You want to control what people are allowed to find funny. Denise stood up as well, her face contorted with anger. I want people to think before they speak, she shouted. I want people to consider the impact of their words. Is that really so terrible? Ricky looked at her with what appeared to be genuine sadness. No, that's not terrible, he said quietly. But attacking someone, making personal judgments about their character, and refusing to have an actual dialogue, that is terrible. That's not how we have productive conversations about difficult topics. Denise pointed an accusatory finger at him. Don't lecture me about productive conversations, she hissed. You've made a career out of being provocative. You live for controversy. Ricky let out a long breath. I live for making people laugh, he corrected. And yes, sometimes that involves being provocative. But there's a difference between challenging ideas and attacking people personally, which is what you've done here today. The other panelists sat frozen, unsure how to proceed. The audience remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Denise's voice took on a mocking tone. Oh, poor Ricky, she said with exaggerated sympathy. Can't handle a little criticism? I thought you were all about free speech and saying whatever you want. Ricky smiled sadly. I am about free speech, he replied, which is why I'm not trying to stop you from saying these things, even though they're unfair and based on assumptions rather than facts. But free speech also means I'm free to walk away from a conversation that's clearly going nowhere. Denise's expression turned smug. Running away when things get uncomfortable? She taunted. How very brave of you. Ricky picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. I'm not running away, he said calmly. I'm choosing not to participate in a conversation where one person has already decided that nothing I say will matter. You didn't bring me here to talk, Denise. You brought me here to grandstand. Denise laughed harshly. I brought you here to answer for your actions, she said. But clearly you're too much of a coward to do that. The word coward seemed to hang in the air. Ricky stopped moving and looked at Denise with an expression of disbelief. A coward? He repeated slowly. Because I won't sit here and accept baseless accusations about my character? Because I won't let you bully me on national television? Denise's voice dripped with sarcasm. Bully you? She said incredulously. You're a rich, famous man. You can't be bullied. Ricky shook his head. Anyone can be bullied, Denise, he said quietly. Wealth and fame don't make someone immune to being treated poorly. And that's exactly what's happened here today. One of the other panelists tried once more to salvage the situation. Maybe we could start over, she offered hopefully. Take a different approach to the conversation. But Ricky was already putting on his jacket. I appreciate the offer, he said to the other panelist. But I don't think that would help. This isn't about having a difficult conversation. This is about one person wanting to make an example of someone else. Denise crossed her arms tightly. If you leave, everyone will know you couldn't handle the heat, she warned. Ricky paused, looking at her one more time. Let them think what they want, he said simply. I know why I'm leaving. I'm leaving because I have too much respect for myself to sit here and be verbally abused. I'm leaving because this isn't a conversation or an interview. It's a trial where you've already decided I'm guilty. Denise's voice turned cold. You're proving my point, she said. You can dish it out, but you can't take it. Ricky smiled without humor. There's a difference between dishing it out and taking it, he explained patiently. In my work, I make observations and jokes. Sometimes they're provocative. But I'm not personally attacking individuals. I'm not calling specific people disgusting or self-centered or arrogant. What you've done today is fundamentally different from anything I do in my comedy. The producer's voice could be heard faintly through someone's earpiece, likely trying to figure out what to do about the situation. Denise wasn't backing down. You hide behind the word comedy, she accused. At least I have the courage to say what I mean directly. Ricky nodded thoughtfully. You do say what you mean directly, he agreed. And what you mean is hurtful and unfair. You're entitled to your opinion of my work. You're entitled to dislike my comedy. But you're not entitled to make sweeping judgments about who I am as a person based on your interpretation of my work. Denise took a step toward him. I'm entitled to call out bad behavior when I see it, she insisted. Ricky held up a hand. And I'm entitled to leave when someone is being hostile and unreasonable, he countered, which is what's happening right now. The other panelists exchanged worried glances. The audience remained completely silent, captivated by the confrontation, but clearly uncomfortable. Denise's voice became shrill. This is exactly why we need to have these conversations, she exclaimed. Because people like you think you can just walk away when you're challenged. Ricky turned to face her fully one last time. I'm not walking away from a challenge, Denise, he said, his voice firm but not angry. I'm walking away from abuse. There's a significant difference. A challenge would involve questions, dialogue, and mutual respect. What you've offered today is none of those things. Denise opened her mouth to respond, but Ricky continued. You've spent this entire time attacking me personally, he said. You've made assumptions about my character, my motivations, and my values. You've called me names and questioned my decency as a human being, and when I've tried to respond thoughtfully, you've talked over me and dismissed everything I've said. One of the other panelists nodded slightly, clearly agreeing with Ricky's assessment. Denise's face was now bright red with anger and perhaps embarrassment. If you can't handle criticism, you shouldn't be famous, she said, repeating her earlier point. Ricky sighed deeply. This isn't criticism, he said wearily. Criticism would be discussing specific jokes or bits and explaining why you find them problematic. Criticism would be having a nuanced conversation about the role of comedy in society. What you've done is launch a personal attack and then claimed it was criticism when I objected. Denise pointed at him accusingly. You're just upset because someone finally stood up to you, she declared. Ricky smiled sadly again. People stand up to me all the time, Denise, he said. I read critical reviews. I engage with people who disagree with me on social media. I've had many thoughtful conversations with people who find aspects of my work challenging, but those conversations involved respect and good faith. This has been neither respectful nor in good faith. The studio was now filled with an oppressive silence. Even the crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the scene play out. Denise's voice dropped to a bitter whisper that was still picked up by the microphones. You think you're better than everyone else, she said venomously. Ricky looked genuinely puzzled by this accusation. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he replied. "But I do think I deserve basic respect, just like everyone else. And I'm not receiving that here today." He looked at the camera briefly, then back at Denise. "I wish you well," he said simply. "I hope you find whatever it is you were looking for in this conversation, but I'm done." Denise let out a harsh laugh. "Of course you are," she said mockingly. "Run back to your echo chamber where everyone tells you how brilliant you are." Ricky paused at the edge of the set, turning back one final time. "That's an interesting assumption," he said. "But the truth is, I'm going back to a world where people can disagree without being disagreeable, where people can have different opinions without resorting to personal attacks, where conversation is actually possible." With those final words, Ricky Gervais walked off the Loose Women's set. The cameras continued rolling as Denise stood there, arms still crossed, watching him leave. The other panelists looked at each other awkwardly, clearly unsure how to proceed. Denise finally turned to the camera, her face still flushed. "Well," she said, trying to sound triumphant but coming across as defensive, "I think that showed everyone exactly what kind of person he really is." But the audience's silence suggested they might have drawn a very different conclusion. One of the other panelists cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps we should move on to our next segment," she suggested quietly. As the show cut to commercial, the image of Denise's angry face and Ricky's empty chair told the whole story. What was supposed to be a routine interview had turned into one of the most awkward and hostile moments in daytime television history. The comedian had walked in expecting a friendly chat and walked out after being subjected to a barrage of personal attacks disguised as accountability. The host, who thought she was holding someone accountable, had instead revealed her own inability to have a civil conversation with someone whose work she disagreed with. The tension in that studio had been building from the very first question, escalating with each dismissive comment and personal accusation. What viewers had witnessed was not journalism or meaningful dialogue, but rather one person's determination to attack another under the guise of asking tough questions. And in the end, the person who walked away with dignity intact was the one who chose to leave, rather than continue participating in what had become a hostile interrogation rather than an interview.